There's a stone circle in southern Sweden that predates Stonehenge. No one knows who built it. No records exist of their language, their gods, their kings. The Vikings, who would later dominate these lands, had no memory of them. When archaeologists first excavated the site in 1989, they found something beneath the ancient stones, an older foundation, deliberately buried. Someone had built over it. Someone had wanted it forgotten. This isn't a story about the Vikings. This is about what came before them, about the civilizations that rose in Scandinavia thousands of years before longships ever touched water, about societies so completely erased from history that even their names are lost, and about the disturbing pattern emerging from the archaeological record. These cultures didn't just fade away, they were overwritten, layer by layer, memory by memory, until nothing remained but silence. The question isn't whether advanced societies existed in pre-Viking Scandinavia. The evidence is undeniable. The question is why every single one of them disappeared so completely that the people who came after, the Vikings themselves, seem to have had no knowledge they ever existed at all. The first human footprints in Scandinavia are 12,000 years old. They appear at the edge of retreating glaciers, pressed into mud that would eventually fossilize. These weren't nomadic hunters passing through. Archaeological surveys conducted between 2003 and 2018 have revealed something far more sophisticated. Permanent settlements with wooden structures, organized fishing operations, and evidence of long-distance trade networks stretching across the Baltic Sea. By 4000 BCE, communities along the Scandinavian coast were building monuments, massive stone structures that required coordinated labor, advanced engineering knowledge, and a stable enough society to dedicate resources to projects that served no immediate survival function. These weren't primitive tribes. They were organized civilizations with specialists, hierarchies, and shared belief systems complex enough to demand monumental architecture. The Isles Steinar site in Sweden contains 59 massive boulders arranged in the shape of a ship, each stone weighing several tons. The formation is precisely aligned with solar events. Radiocarbon dating places its construction somewhere between 600 BCE and 1000 CE, but excavations beneath the visible stones reveal older foundations, multiple construction phases, earlier versions of the same site, built and rebuilt over centuries. What's disturbing isn't just the sophistication, it's the continuity. Someone was maintaining this site across generations, passing down knowledge of its significance, its astronomical alignments, its ritual importance, and then, at some point, that knowledge chain broke. The site was abandoned. The people who built it vanished from history so completely that when Swedish archaeologists began studying it in the 1950s, they had to invent theories about who might have created it. In 2011, archaeologists excavating near Motala in Sweden made a discovery that would challenge every assumption about early Scandinavian society. Buried in what had once been a shallow lake, they found human skulls, 11 of them. Each skull had been mounted on wooden stakes. The skulls showed evidence of careful preparation, cleaning, possibly display. 2 of the skulls still had pieces of other skulls placed inside them, a practice with no parallel in later Scandinavian cultures. The site dated to 6000 BCE, 8,000 years ago. The people who created this ritual were contemporaries of the earliest agricultural societies in Mesopotamia. They had developed complex funerary practices that suggest a sophisticated understanding of death, memory, and the boundary between the living and the dead. And they did this in Scandinavia, a region historians long dismissed as culturally backward until the Viking Age. But here's what keeps researchers awake at night. This practice appears nowhere else in the archaeological record, not in later Scandinavian sites, not in neighboring regions. It emerged, flourished for some unknown period, and then vanished completely. No cultural continuity, no evolution into related practices, just absence. The funnel beaker culture emerges in the archaeological record around 4000 BCE, spreading across what is now Denmark, southern Sweden, and northern Germany. They weren't hunter-gatherers. They were farmers with domesticated cattle, pigs, and sheep. They grew wheat and barley. They produced sophisticated pottery with distinctive funnel-shaped necks, hence the name. But that's not what makes them remarkable. the funnel Beaker people built megaliths, thousands of them. Stone chambers, dolmens, passage graves, some of the oldest monumental architecture in Northern Europe. These weren't simple cairns. They were engineered structures with multiple chambers, precise astronomical alignments, and construction techniques that required advanced mathematical understanding. A single passage grave might contain dozens of burials accumulated over centuries, suggesting these sites served as ancestral monuments for specific lineages or communities. The distribution of grave goods shows clear social stratification. Some burials contain elaborate amber jewelry, copper artifacts traded from distant regions, finely crafted axes. Others contain nothing. This was a society with elites, with inherited wealth, with the organizational capacity to maintain long-term construction projects. They also created causewayed enclosures, large circular earthworks with multiple entrances surrounded by ditches. These weren't defensive structures. Archaeological evidence suggests they were ceremonial centers where people gathered for seasonal festivals, religious rituals, possibly large-scale feasting. One enclosure in Denmark shows evidence of massive cattle slaughter, hundreds of animals killed and consumed during what must have been enormous communal gatherings. This culture lasted for over 1,000 years, long enough to develop regional variations, long enough to build thousands of monuments, long enough that people living in 3500 BCE had inherited traditions that stretched back 20 generations. And then they disappeared, not gradually, not through gradual cultural assimilation. The archaeological record shows a sudden collapse around 2800 BCE, settlements abandoned, construction projects left unfinished. The pottery style that defined them vanishes from the record. Within a few generations, the funnel Beaker culture is gone. What replaced them is almost more disturbing. The pitted ware culture emerges in the same regions, but they're completely different. They're hunter-gatherers, not farmers. They reject agriculture, returning to marine resources and seal hunting. Their pottery is cruder. Their settlements are smaller. They build no monuments. It's as if the clock had been turned back 2,000 years, as if the accumulated knowledge of farming, architecture, and social organization had been deliberately abandoned. And here's the critical detail. Pitted ware sites are often built directly on top of funnel Beaker settlements. They reused the same locations but didn't continue the traditions. They knew the monuments were there, they lived among them, but they didn't maintain them, didn't honor them, didn't incorporate them into their own cultural practices. The people who came after had no memory of what came before. In the summer of 536 CE, something happened that nearly ended human civilization in the Northern Hemisphere. Historical records from the Mediterranean describe it. The sun dimmed. For 18 months, it gave no more light than the moon. Temperatures plummeted. Crops failed. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. Modern climate science has confirmed what happened. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that it blocked solar radiation across the entire northern hemisphere. Tree ring data from Scandinavia shows growth rings so narrow they're barely visible, years when trees barely survived. Ice core samples from Greenland contain massive ash deposits dated to 536 CE. This wasn't a local disaster. This was a hemispheric catastrophe. And Scandinavia, already at the northern edge of agricultural viability, was devastated. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia show the same pattern: settlements abandoned in the early 6th century. Not gradually, not through migration, just emptied. Houses left with possessions still inside, fields unplowed. The population of Scandinavia may have dropped by 50% or more within a single generation. But here's what makes this event so chilling. It's not the only one. The climate record shows multiple similar events throughout Scandinavian prehistory. Major volcanic eruptions in 1628 BCE, 1159 BCE, 940 BCE, each one triggering crop failures, famine, population collapse. The people living through these events didn't understand what was happening. They had no concept of volcanic winter, no scientific framework for understanding why the sun had dimmed. What they knew was that the world was ending, that the gods had abandoned them, that everything their ancestors had built was crumbling, and they responded the way humans always respond to existential catastrophe, with ritual, with sacrifice, with desperate attempts to appease forces they couldn't comprehend. In 1950, Danish peat cutters discovered a body in a bog near Toland. The corpse was so well preserved by the acidic, oxygen-free environment that they initially thought it was a recent murder victim. Forensic examination revealed the truth. The body was over 2,000 years old. The Toland man, as he came to be known, had been hanged with a leather rope. His face was peaceful, almost serene. He'd been carefully placed in the bog, not dumped. Over the next 70 years, hundreds more bodies would be discovered in bogs across Scandinavia and northern Europe. The pattern was consistent: violent deaths, careful placement, dates clustering around periods of environmental stress. These weren't murder victims. They were sacrifices. Some of the bodies show evidence of extreme violence. Multiple methods of death: strangled, throat cut, skull crushed, as if the killers wanted to ensure the death through every means possible. Others show signs of high social status: well-groomed hands, good nutrition, elaborate hairstyles. These weren't criminals or slaves, they were chosen. The most disturbing details come from analysis of their last meals. Many bog bodies had consumed a specific mixture of grains and seeds before death, a ritual meal found nowhere else in the archaeological record. They knew they were going to die. They participated in the ritual that would end their lives. Climate data from these periods shows the same pattern: volcanic winters, crop failures, societal stress. The societies producing these sacrifices were collapsing, and they were killing their own people in increasingly desperate attempts to reverse it. It didn't work. The Kivik grave in Sweden is one of the most impressive Bronze Age monuments in Scandinavia. It's a massive cairn, a mound of stones 75 meters in diameter, containing a stone burial chamber. The chamber walls are carved with images: ships, warriors, processions, ritual scenes. It dates to around 1000 BCE, during the Nordic Bronze Age, a period when Scandinavian societies had developed bronze metallurgy, extensive trade networks, and sophisticated artistic traditions. But when archaeologists excavated the surrounding area, they found something unexpected. The impressive grave was built on top of earlier settlements, multiple layers of occupation, each one showing signs of sudden abandonment, fire damage, unburied dead, artifacts scattered rather than carefully stored, the signs of catastrophic collapse, not gradual transition. The Nordic Bronze Age lasted from roughly 1700 BCE to 500 BCE. For over 1,000 years, Scandinavian societies thrived. They produced some of the finest bronze work in Europe: elaborate weapons, jewelry, ritual objects. They built massive burial mounds that required hundreds of workers. They carved thousands of rock art panels showing ships, warriors, and religious symbols. The rock carvings at Tanum in Sweden contain over 1,500 individual images. They show complex scenes: ships with multiple crew members, warriors in formation, figures engaged in ritual acts. These aren't primitive stick figures. They're sophisticated representations that required planning, artistic skill, and shared symbolic language. The people who created them had time for art, resources for non-survival activities, and cultural traditions stable enough to maintain consistent symbolic vocabulary across centuries. And then, around 500 BCE, it ends. Not gradually, not through cultural evolution into something new. The archaeological record shows the same pattern seen in earlier collapses: abandoned settlements, construction projects left unfinished, trade networks collapsing. Climate data from this period shows another catastrophic event: temperature drops, harvest failures, shortened growing seasons. Tree rings from Swedish oaks show growth disruption severe enough to suggest multiple consecutive failed harvests. But there's something else in the archaeological record from this period: evidence of violence, fortified settlements, weapon hoards buried in bogs, hundreds of swords, spears, shields, deliberately destroyed and deposited, not lost in battle, ritually killed and offered to gods who weren't listening. The societies that emerged after the Bronze Age collapse were different, smaller, more isolated. The long-distance trade networks were gone. The monumental architecture stopped. the artistic tradition of rock carvings ended abruptly. There are almost no new carvings after 500 BCE. Knowledge was lost. The technique for making bronze was forgotten in many areas. Iron becomes the dominant metal not because it's better, but because the trade networks that supplied tin for bronze no longer existed. The astronomical knowledge encoded in stone circles and burial alignments faded. The ritual traditions that had justified massive communal labor projects lost their power. What survived was a landscape full of monuments no one understood anymore. Massive burial mounds dominating hilltops. Stone circles whose purpose was forgotten. Rock carvings whose meaning had become opaque. The people who came after, the ancestors of the Vikings, lived among these ruins. But they didn't maintain them, didn't honor them, didn't incorporate them into their own cultural narratives in any meaningful way. They built their own settlements on top of older sites, using the ruins as convenient quarries, reusing stones from monuments they didn't understand. And with each generation, the memory faded. The knowledge that these sites represented sophisticated civilizations was lost. The people who had built them became mythical. Giants, dwarves, elves, the supernatural inhabitants of a half-remembered past. By the 8th century CE, when the Viking Age officially begins, Scandinavia had already been inhabited by complex societies for 10,000 years. But if you asked a Viking about the massive stone monuments dotting their landscape, about the elaborate burial mounds, about the rock carvings showing ships and warriors, they had no historical framework for understanding them. Viking Age sagas and poetry are full of references to ancient ruins, but they're interpreted through mythology rather than history. The massive burial mounds were obviously built by giants. Who else could move such enormous stones? The stone circles were created by dwarves or sorcerers. The abandoned settlements were the work of the Alfar, supernatural beings who predated human habitation. This wasn't ignorance. The Vikings were sophisticated people with strong oral traditions, complex legal systems, far-reaching trade networks. They maintained genealogies going back generations, memorized thousands of lines of poetry, navigated across open oceans using astronomical observations. But they had no memory of the people who came before them. The Bronze Age cultures, the Neolithic monument builders, the funnel Beaker farmers, all were gone so completely that even their names were forgotten. What's chilling is that this erasure seems to have been partially intentional. Archaeological excavations of Viking Age sites built on top of earlier monuments show a consistent pattern. The Vikings knew these sites were old. They deliberately chose them for their own use. But they didn't preserve them. They built directly on top of them, incorporating older stones into new structures, disrupting earlier burials to make room for their own dead. At the old Uppsala site in Sweden, massive burial mounds from the 6th century CE dominate the landscape. These are royal graves, the burial place of Swedish kings. But excavations show they're built on top of much older ritual sites, earlier burial grounds, older monuments. The Vikings who built the royal mounds in the 6th century were constructing their dynasty's legitimacy literally on top of forgotten civilizations, and they created new myths to explain the landscape they inhabited. The Prose Edda, written in the 13th century but recording much older oral traditions, contains elaborate creation myths, stories of gods and giants, cosmic battles. But no history, no memory of the actual human societies that had built the monuments the Vikings lived among. The sagas occasionally reference ancient ruins in ways that suggest unease. They're haunted places, dangerous places, home to Draugr, undead guardians of forgotten treasures. Places where the boundary between worlds was thin, but never places built by ancestors, by earlier human cultures with their own histories and achievements. This erasure extended to language. By the Viking Age, the languages spoken in Scandinavia were North Germanic tongues, the ancestors of modern Swedish, Norwegian, Danish. But there's evidence of earlier linguistic layers. Place names that don't derive from North Germanic roots, river names, mountain names, settlement names that are clearly much older, inherited from languages no longer spoken. Linguists call these substrate languages, tongues spoken by earlier populations that left traces in place, names and loanwords, but vanished as languages in their own right. The people who spoke them were assimilated, their languages forgotten, their cultural identity erased. What the Vikings inherited was a palimpsest, a landscape where older meanings had been written over, sometimes multiple times, leaving only fragmentary traces. And with each generation, even those traces faded. The most disturbing evidence comes from comparative mythology. When scholars examined Viking Age myths and compared them to earlier Scandinavian archaeological evidence, they found disconnects. The gods the Vikings worshipped, Odin, Thor, Freyr, appear relatively late in the archaeological record. Earlier Scandinavian societies seem to have had different religious practices, different symbolic systems. The Bronze Age rock carvings show religious iconography that doesn't match Viking Age beliefs. Ship symbolism is prominent, but in contexts that suggest different mythological frameworks. Solar symbols, fertility imagery, ritual processions, all indicating complex religious beliefs that were replaced by Viking Age mythology. This means the Vikings themselves were engaged in a process of cultural replacement. They weren't simply preserving ancient traditions, they were creating new ones, and in the process, allowing older traditions to die. The conversion to Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries accelerated this process. Christian missionaries deliberately targeted old ritual sites, building churches on top of pagan temples, transforming sacred groves into Christian holy sites. But they were following a pattern that was already ancient, the pattern of new cultures overriding old ones, claiming sacred spaces, erasing memories. By the time the first written histories of Scandinavia were produced in the 12th and 13th centuries, the pre-Viking past had become entirely mythological. The authors of these texts, educated Christians, often trained in continental monasteries, had no framework for understanding the archaeological evidence surrounding them. The massive stone monuments were ancient. Everyone agreed on that. But ancient how? Built by whom? For what purpose? They had no answers. The chain of cultural memory had been broken so thoroughly that even educated scholars living among Bronze Age ruins had no idea what they were looking at. And so, they invented answers. They borrowed from classical mythology, from Christian traditions, from folk tales. They created elaborate pseudo-histories involving migrations from Troy, legendary kings, mythical founders. These stories had no basis in archaeological reality, but they filled the void where actual history should have been. The tragedy is that information existed. Burial goods, settlement patterns, artistic traditions, all encoded information about the societies that created them. But information isn't knowledge. Knowledge requires continuity, requires someone to teach the next generation what the symbols mean, what the rituals signify, what the monuments commemorate. When that continuity breaks, information becomes mystery, and mystery becomes myth. In 2003, archaeologists excavating a Viking Age farmstead in Norway made an unexpected discovery. Beneath the Viking layers, they found earlier occupation, a late Bronze Age settlement. The Bronze Age structures had been deliberately dismantled, their stones reused in Viking Age buildings. But in one corner of the site, they found something the Vikings had apparently missed: a small cache of objects carefully wrapped and buried, bronze jewelry, polished stone axes, amber beads, and something unexpected, a small wooden box containing what appeared to be carefully preserved seeds. Radiocarbon dating confirmed these were Bronze Age artifacts. But the seeds were puzzling. They weren't local to Norway. DNA analysis eventually identified them. They were seeds from plants native to the eastern Mediterranean. This tiny cache represented something profound. These Bronze Age people had maintained trade connections across thousands of miles. They had valued these foreign seeds enough to preserve them carefully. And someone, in the final days of their culture's collapse, had buried this cache, whether hoping to preserve something precious for a future that never came, or as a final ritual offering, we'll never know. The Vikings who later built their farm on this site had no idea this cache existed. They lived their lives, raised their children, maintained their own traditions, completely unaware that 1,500 years earlier, people had stood on this same spot, participating in trade networks and cultural practices just as sophisticated as their own. That's what erasure looks like. Not dramatic destruction, not conquest and burning, just time, collapse, and the quiet failure of memory to bridge the gap between one civilization and the next. The climate events that triggered these collapses weren't unique to Scandinavia. The volcanic winter of 536 CE affected the entire northern hemisphere. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE was a Mediterranean-wide catastrophe. But Scandinavia's geographic isolation and marginal agricultural viability made it particularly vulnerable. When trade networks collapsed, when climate deteriorated, when social systems failed, there was often nowhere to retreat to, no southern lands to migrate toward, no stable neighboring civilization to provide continuity. So, societies collapsed completely, and in the aftermath, survivors rebuilt, but differently. With smaller populations, simpler technologies, truncated cultural memories. Each collapse was a bottleneck, filtering which knowledge survived. Practical survival skills made it through: how to fish, hunt, farm the marginal soils. But elaborate astronomical knowledge, the significance of ancient monuments, the names and achievements of the people who came before, those were luxuries that starving societies couldn't maintain. And so, generation by generation, the past became more distant, more mythological, more completely lost. Modern archaeology has recovered some of what was forgotten. We can now date the monuments, analyze the artifacts, reconstruct the trade networks. We know the Bronze Age Scandinavians had connections to the Eastern Mediterranean. We know the Neolithic farmers had sophisticated social hierarchies. We know multiple advanced societies rose and fell in Scandinavia long before the Vikings. But we still don't know their names. We don't know what they called themselves, what languages they spoke, what myths they told. We know they existed, but not who they were. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What are we forgetting? In 2019, a team of archaeologists published a disturbing finding. They had been analyzing skeletal remains from across Scandinavia, spanning from the Neolithic through the Viking Age. The DNA evidence told a story of repeated population replacements. The farmers who replaced the hunters, the Bronze Age people who replaced the farmers, the Iron Age people who came after them, each wave bringing new genes, new languages, new cultural practices. But the replacements weren't complete. Small amounts of DNA from earlier populations persisted in later ones, which means there were survivors, people who lived through the collapses, who witnessed their civilization's end, who tried to preserve something of what came before. They failed, not through lack of effort, but because cultural transmission is fragile. It requires stable conditions, requires the next generation to value what the previous generation knew, requires continuity of language and context. When societies collapse catastrophically, when populations drop by 50% in a generation, when children grow up in survival mode rather than learning specialized knowledge, when the very structures that encoded cultural memory are abandoned, the chain breaks. And once it breaks, it can't be repaired. The information is lost. Forever. Modern civilization tends to view itself as immune to this process. We have writing, we have digital archives, we have institutions dedicated to preserving knowledge. The ancient civilizations of Scandinavia had none of these advantages. Of course they were forgotten, but that confidence may be misplaced. Archaeological sites across Scandinavia show that the Bronze Age people did have ways of encoding information. Astronomical alignments in monuments, symbolic systems in rock art, ritual practices that embedded knowledge in repeated actions. They had oral traditions, specialized knowledge keepers, social structures designed to pass information between generations. It didn't matter. When the climate failed, when the crops died, when the trade networks collapsed, all of it crumbled. The specialized knowledge keepers died or fled. The young people who should have learned the traditions were too busy trying to survive. The monuments became mysterious ruins in the space of 2 or 3 generations. Our writing, our archives, our institutions, they're more robust than Bronze Age oral traditions. But they're not invulnerable. They require stable social systems to maintain them. They require people who value preservation over immediate survival. They require continuity. The archaeological record suggests that sophisticated civilizations have risen and fallen in Scandinavia at least 5 or 6 times over the past 10,000 years. Each time, the people who came after had no memory of what came before. Each time, the accumulated knowledge of centuries was lost. And each time, the people living through the collapse probably believed theirs was the first civilization, that the ruins around them were relics of a mythological past, that they were fundamentally different from whoever came before. They were wrong, the cycle had repeated itself, and they were living through just the latest iteration. In 2021, climate scientists published projections for Scandinavia's future: warming temperatures, disrupted weather patterns, agricultural stress. The changes won't be as dramatic as a volcanic winter. They'll be slower, spread over decades rather than years. But the trajectory is clear. The same region that has seen multiple climate-driven civilizational collapses is facing another period of environmental instability. Modern Scandinavia is wealthy, technologically advanced, well integrated into global systems. It's not comparable to Bronze Age societies operating at the edge of survival, but that's what every society tells itself, that they're different, that they're more advanced, that they've learned from the past. Except the past is exactly what we're talking about. The Scandinavian past is a chronicle of civilizations that rose, flourished, accumulated knowledge, and built monuments, and then vanished so completely that even their names are forgotten. The Vikings who built their farms on top of Bronze Age ruins probably thought themselves vastly superior to whatever primitive people came before them. They had iron tools, they had ships that could cross oceans, they had sophisticated legal systems. And in many ways, they were right. But they were also living in a cultural landscape that had been catastrophically impoverished by collapse. The knowledge lost in the Bronze Age collapse, astronomical observations, mathematical understanding, artistic traditions, was never recovered. Each collapse doesn't just reset civilization, it subtracts from it. Knowledge lost is rarely completely relearned, sometimes because the conditions that made it necessary or possible no longer exist. Sometimes because the very idea that such knowledge existed has been forgotten. The Scandinavian archaeological record contains monuments whose purpose we still don't understand, stone arrangements, burial practices, symbolic systems that remain opaque despite sophisticated analysis. Not because the people who created them were more advanced than us, but because the cultural context that gave them meaning was completely erased. And those monuments stand as warnings. They prove that it's possible for sophisticated civilizations to be forgotten entirely, that cultural memory can be erased, that the knowledge and achievements of thousands of years can vanish in a handful of generations. The Vikings eventually faded too, not through collapse, through gradual integration into Christian European culture. By the 12th century, the Viking Age was over, the longships stopped raiding, the pagan temples were replaced by churches. The runic alphabet was abandoned for Latin script. A few hundred years later, the Viking Age itself had become mythology. Renaissance scholars reading medieval Icelandic sagas thought they were reading fantasy, not history. The idea that Scandinavian pagans had actually existed, had raided across Europe, had built a brief but significant civilization, it seemed implausible. It took archaeological evidence to confirm that, yes, these people were real. This culture actually existed. How long until the Vikings themselves are as forgotten as the Bronze Age people they replaced? How long until our own civilization is mysterious ruins, purpose unknown, builders lost to time? The archaeological record suggests that the process is faster than we'd like to believe. The funnel Beaker culture, 1,000 years of continuous occupation, thousands of monuments, sophisticated agricultural societies, forgotten completely within a few generations of collapse. The Bronze Age, when 200 years of trade, metallurgy, artistic achievement, reduced to mythology by the Iron Age, the Vikings, 3 centuries of European dominance, became debatable legend within 500 years of their endpoint. Each of these cultures probably believed they would be remembered, probably thought their achievements were too significant to forget. The monuments they built were designed to last. The Bronze Age people carved their symbols into bedrock, clearly intending them to endure. The Vikings raised runestones to commemorate their dead, expecting those stones to carry names forward into the future. They were all wrong. The monuments endure, but the meaning is lost. The symbols persist, but no one can read them. The names are carved in stone, but no one remembers who they were, and we're doing the same thing. building monuments, physical and digital, that we assume will preserve our civilization's memory, creating archives, databases, cultural institutions designed to carry knowledge forward. But preservation requires continuity. It requires stable societies with resources to maintain archives, with populations that value the past, with unbroken chains of knowledge transmission. The Scandinavian archaeological record shows what happens when that continuity breaks. When societies collapse, archives are abandoned, cultural institutions fail, knowledge is lost, and then the forgetting begins. There's a dolmen in Denmark, a Neolithic burial chamber made of massive stone slabs. It's been standing for 5,000 years, one of thousands of such monuments scattered across Scandinavia. For most of those 5,000 years, no one remembered who built it or why. The farmers who tended fields around it in the Bronze Age probably had stories. Maybe giants built it. Maybe it was the work of gods. Those stories were lost. The Iron Age people who saw it had different stories. Those stories were also lost. The Vikings who raided across Europe walked past it, knowing only that it was ancient, that something about it mattered, but not what. When Danish archaeologists first began studying it in the 19th century, they invented theories. Maybe it was built by migrants from the south. Maybe it was an altar for human sacrifice. Those theories were wrong, but for decades they were the best explanation available. Modern archaeology has given us better answers. We know approximately when it was built. We know the culture that created it. We can analyze the bones buried inside, reconstruct diets and diseases, trace genetic lineages, but we still don't know the one thing that mattered most to the people who built it, what it meant to them, what rituals they performed there, what beliefs justified the enormous labor of quarrying and moving multi-ton stones, what names they gave their dead. The information is lost, irrecoverable. The people who knew are 5,000 years dead, and they left no written records. The meaning died with them. This isn't a unique situation. This is the norm. For every civilization we know about, there are dozens we don't. For every monument whose purpose we understand, there are hundreds that remain mysterious. The past is mostly darkness, illuminated by occasional sparks of surviving evidence. But the darkness is always larger than the light, and we're adding to it, right now, this moment. Languages are dying, last speakers passing away, taking irreplaceable knowledge with them. Cultural practices are being abandoned. Traditional knowledge about plants, animals, ecological relationships, accumulated over thousands of years, is being lost as indigenous communities are displaced or assimilated. It's the same process that erased the Bronze Age civilizations, the same process that left Vikings wandering among ruins they couldn't understand, just slower, more gradual, easy to ignore because it doesn't feel catastrophic. But from an archaeological perspective, gradual loss and catastrophic collapse produce the same result: absence, silence, mystery, 10,000 years from now. If archaeologists excavate our cities, what will they know? They'll find our monuments. Our concrete and steel structures will persist much longer than Bronze Age wooden buildings. They'll find our artifacts, billions of them, from smartphones to plastic bottles. But will they understand what mattered to us? Will they know our languages, our beliefs, our fears? Will they be able to read our digital archives, assuming any storage medium survives that long? Or will we be mysteries to them? A civilization that built strange monuments, produced bizarre artifacts, and then vanished, leaving ruins that future cultures will reinterpret according to their own mythologies? The Scandinavian archaeological record suggests the latter is more likely. Not because we're less advanced than we think, but because cultural memory is fragile. Because continuity is hard to maintain. Because collapse, whether gradual or catastrophic, breaks the chains that connect past to future. The people who built the dolmen in Denmark thought they were creating something permanent. They succeeded. The structure still stands. But the meaning didn't survive. The cultural context, the beliefs, the significance, all gone. We're doing the same thing. Building monuments, physical and cultural, that we hope will outlast us. Maybe they will, but monuments without meaning are just stones arranged in interesting patterns. Artifacts without context are just mysterious objects. The forgetting is already happening. Most people in Scandinavia walk past Neolithic monuments without knowing what they are. The Bronze Age rock carvings are tourist attractions, their actual significance lost. The Viking Age is popular culture, horned helmets and fantasy novels, bearing little resemblance to historical reality. Each generation remembers less. Each iteration of cultural transmission loses information. The process is slow enough that we don't notice, fast enough that within a few centuries, vast amounts of knowledge are simply gone. And unlike the Bronze Age Scandinavians, we can't claim ignorance. We know this happens. We have thousands of years of archaeological evidence showing exactly how civilizations are forgotten. We've watched it happen to societies around the world. We know, and we do it anyway. Because cultural memory is optional. Preservation requires effort. It requires societies to value the past enough to invest resources in maintaining archives, teaching history, protecting monuments. It requires the next generation to care about what the previous generation knew. And when societies face stress, climate disasters, economic collapse, political instability, preservation becomes a luxury. Survival takes priority. The archives are abandoned. The monuments decay. The knowledge dies with the old people who carry it. This isn't hypothetical. It's pattern. It's happened repeatedly in Scandinavia alone. And Scandinavia isn't unique. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex built 11,000 years ago, was deliberately buried by its creators. They ended their civilization by covering their most sacred site with earth. Who were they? What did they believe? We have no idea. The culture that came after them had no memory of them. Cahokia in North America, a city of 20,000 people, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, was abandoned in the 13th century. When European colonizers arrived 400 years later, even local indigenous tribes had no memory of who built it. The Indus Valley Civilization, sophisticated urban centers, advanced engineering, a writing system we still can't decipher, collapsed around 1900 BCE. The people who came after forgot the cities had ever existed until archaeologists rediscovered them in the 1920s. The pattern repeats. Advanced civilizations rise. They build monuments, develop technologies, accumulate knowledge. They collapse, and the people who come after forget them. Not because the evidence disappears. The monuments remain, the artifacts persist, the information is there. But information without transmission is just noise. It's data without meaning. It's ruins in the landscape, mysterious and unexplained. The Scandinavian archaeological record is unique only in how well documented it is. Multiple cycles of rise and fall, each one leaving evidence, each one demonstrating the same pattern. Sophisticated societies can be completely forgotten in a handful of generations, and if it happened to them, multiple times, in multiple forms. Why do we think we're immune? What makes us believe that our monuments will be understood, our languages deciphered, our achievements remembered? The Bronze Age Scandinavians had advantages we don't. Their knowledge systems were designed for oral transmission, optimized for memorization and teaching. Ours are digital, dependent on technologies that require stable power grids, compatible hardware, functioning institutions. When Bronze Age trade networks collapsed, people still remembered how to farm, how to fish, how to survive. When our supply chains fail, how many of us know how to maintain the technologies we depend on? The archaeological record suggests we're more vulnerable than the people we've forgotten, more specialized, more dependent on complex systems, more likely to lose knowledge catastrophically when those systems fail. And they will fail, not might, will. Climate projections, resource depletion, ecological degradation, the stresses building on modern civilization are comparable to those that triggered previous collapses, slower in some ways, faster in others, but ultimately destabilizing. When the stress becomes critical, when societies have to choose between maintaining archives and maintaining survival, we already know what choice gets made. We've seen it repeatedly. The archives are abandoned, the knowledge is lost. The next generation grows up among ruins they don't understand. And then the forgetting accelerates. Without written records, without cultural institutions to maintain memory, the past becomes mythology within a few generations. The sophisticated civilizations that came before become tales of giants and gods. The monuments become mysterious. The achievements become unbelievable. Eventually, even the mythology fades. Even the stories are forgotten. And all that remains is archaeological evidence, mute, mysterious, requiring future civilizations to painstakingly reconstruct what was once common knowledge. This is what happened in Scandinavia, multiple times, to multiple sophisticated civilizations. This is what's happening now, globally, to us. The question isn't whether we'll be forgotten. The archaeological record makes that answer clear. We will be. The question is how completely. How much will survive? How much of what we consider important, our values, our knowledge, our achievements, will make it through the bottleneck to whatever comes after? And the uncomfortable answer, based on thousands of years of Scandinavian evidence, is less than we hope, probably much less. The dolmen in Denmark still stands after 5,000 years. But the meaning is gone, the builders are forgotten, even their names are lost. Our monuments will probably last longer, our concrete and steel structures will endure for millennia. Future archaeologists will find them, study them, create theories about what they were for. But will they understand? Will they know what they meant to us? Or will we be mysteries to them, strange structures built by a forgotten people, interpreted according to whatever mythology the future creates to fill the void where our history should have been? The Scandinavian archaeological record suggests the latter, not because the evidence won't survive, but because meaning requires continuity. Understanding requires unbroken chains of cultural transmission. Memory requires societies stable enough to value preservation. And when those conditions fail, when continuity breaks, when transmission fails, when societies collapse, forgetting is inevitable. The Vikings stood among Bronze Age ruins and saw mysteries. We stand among Viking ruins and see tourist attractions. Future generations will stand among our ruins and see what? Whatever they see, it won't be us. Not really. Not the full complexity of who we were, what we valued, what we believed. It will be fragments, misinterpretations, theories that fit their frameworks rather than ours. And that's if we're lucky. If something survives, if future civilizations arise that care about the past, that have resources for archaeology, that value understanding over forgetting. The alternative is complete erasure. The fate of the funnel Beaker people, the Bronze Age Scandinavians, the pre-Viking monument builders, civilizations that rose, flourished, and vanished so completely that even their existence was forgotten until modern archaeology rediscovered them. We know this happens. We have proof. We have thousands of years of evidence showing exactly how civilizations are forgotten, and we're doing nothing different. Building monuments, creating archives, assuming continuity, believing we'll be remembered. The past suggests otherwise. The past suggests that we're just the latest iteration of a pattern that has repeated itself over and over, that future generations will stand among our ruins, creating myths to explain what they find, having no idea who we really were. The archaeological record doesn't lie. Civilizations are forgotten, knowledge is lost, memory fails, and we are not immune. The stones in Denmark will outlast us all, but the meaning, the significance, the understanding of who we were and what mattered to us, that's already fading. The forgetting has begun. So what comes next? What happens when our civilization joins the list of forgotten cultures? When our monuments become mysterious ruins? When future archaeologists struggle to interpret our artifacts? The Scandinavian pattern suggests an answer. Survivors rebuild. They create new cultures, new traditions, new ways of understanding the world. They live among the ruins of what came before without understanding them, creating new mythologies to explain the unexplainable. And eventually, if conditions allow, they build their own monuments, create their own sophisticated cultures, accumulate their own knowledge, until the next collapse, the next forgetting, the next cycle. The archaeological evidence spanning 10,000 years of Scandinavian history shows this pattern repeating at least 5 or 6 times, each cycle lasting centuries or millennia, each one leaving ruins that the next civilization doesn't understand. There's no reason to think the cycle has ended. No evidence that we've somehow transcended the conditions that produced collapse in the past. If anything, We're more vulnerable, more specialized, more dependent on complex systems, more likely to lose knowledge catastrophically when those systems fail, which means we're likely living in the brief flourishing period between collapses, the period when everything seems stable, when knowledge accumulates, when monuments are built, the period that always ends. The people living through previous collapses probably didn't recognize what was happening. They probably thought the problems were temporary, that their civilization was too advanced to fail, that they were fundamentally different from whoever came before. They were wrong, and we're probably wrong too. But here's the disturbing implication. If the cycle is inevitable, if collapse and forgetting are simply what happens to civilizations given enough time, then preservation becomes a moral imperative. Not because it will prevent collapse, it won't, but because it determines how much survives, how much knowledge makes it through the bottleneck, how quickly the next civilization can rebuild. The Bronze Age Scandinavians left monuments that endured even though their meaning was lost. Those monuments provided future civilizations with evidence that sophisticated cultures had existed, even if the specifics were forgotten. That's not nothing, it's less than we'd like, but it's more than complete erasure. We have advantages they didn't: writing, digital archives, distributed storage, institutional memory. If we prioritize preservation, if we make conscious choices about what to protect, how to encode information in ways that might survive, what knowledge is critical to maintain, we can potentially preserve more than previous civilizations managed. But it requires acknowledging that collapse is possible, that our civilization is not immune, that the forgetting can happen to us. And that's the acknowledgement most societies refuse to make, because it's psychologically easier to believe we're different, that we've learned from the past, that our technology, our knowledge, our sophistication protects us. The archaeological record says otherwise, says that every civilization thinks it's different, and every civilization is forgotten. So, here we are, living in Scandinavia or anywhere else, walking past monuments we barely notice, surrounded by history we don't understand, confident that we're different from all the forgotten civilizations that came before. Meanwhile, the stones endure, the monuments stand, the evidence accumulates, waiting for future archaeologists who will excavate our cities, study our artifacts, create theories about who we were, theories that will probably be wrong, but it won't matter. We'll be gone. Our language is dead, our meanings lost. Just another layer in the archaeological record. Just another mysterious civilization that built strange monuments and then vanished. The cycle continues, the forgetting accelerates, the darkness grows, and the stones remain, outlasting everything. Monuments, meanings, memories, all of it. What do you think happens when cultural memory breaks, when the chain connecting past to future snaps completely? Comment your thoughts below.